Hello everyone, welcome back to Brian's Mysteries and Adventures on Trail. Today's video we're going to be talking about two separate cases, but they're all connected to basically this first case. There's a lot of information, a lot of crazy things that happened. All of this took place on or around the Appalachian Trail. Before we begin, if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. It's free and really helps out the channel a lot. Back in 2003, a young newlywed couple named Brian and Randy Trimble moved to the town of Harrisburg, more specifically a small suburb just outside the city. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania is right along the Appalachian Trail. I'm going to have a map up for you to see right here. Brian was dealing with MS, which is a chronic condition, but depending on the circumstances and the medication, people can live long lives. In Brian's situation, Randy was just absolutely amazing. She took wonderful care of him. She was always very supportive. This is a picture of Brian and Randy, and this is the house that they moved into on Wood Street in Camp Hill, Pennsylvania in 2002. They both got very good jobs. Brian got a tech job with a big healthcare company. Every time friends would ask them, they both would tell their friends that everything was going so well. They were thinking about starting a family. From the outside, everybody thought things were great. Everything looked great. Then sometime in 2002, Brian met this guy, a guy by the name of Blaine Norris. He was working at the same company. This guy was around the same age. He was known as basically a computer hacker. He liked to play role-playing games online. He told Brian that his real passion was film. He was really into horror movies, and he already had come up with an idea for a horror movie on the Appalachian Trail called Through Hike. Despite having no experience with filming, and he himself was married and they just had a young baby, he was obsessed with starting this film. He took Brian out to the area of the Appalachian Trail to show him the area. I know a lot of these pictures are fuzzy, but remember this is 20 years old, some of these pictures. This is just Brian out with Blaine right there with the camera. The problem was Blaine didn't have any money, and this project was going to cost $25,000 to $30,000. For some reason, Brian was just mesmerized by not only this idea, but by this guy Blaine. He went back to his wife Randy and asked if they could take this money out of their savings to pay for this film. Her reaction, like most people's would be, she said, "No, we don't have any experience in this. We barely know this guy." Brian was upset by this, but he had agreed to be the cameraman for this film. He told Blaine he couldn't afford the money. Despite all this, they went ahead with doing this production. These are some pictures of the actual auditions that Blaine held in his basement for this movie called Through Hike, which was based on a group of 5 hikers hiking the Appalachian Trail that came across this ghost that had died somewhere on the Appalachian Trail named Samuel Tootin, and one by one this ghost was going to kill each of them. According to people that knew him, everyone said that Blaine was very narcissistic, he was very manipulative. They also said that he could be very funny and he was very meticulous about this movie script. He was very thorough, so they thought that this was going to be a fun idea. Keep in mind though, none of them had any experience hiking or camping, never mind even through hiking. They were planning on being out in the wilderness for a little over a week to film this movie, Through Hike. Right before they started, Brian told Blaine that, hey, he wasn't going to be able to film this. His wife was worried about him for obvious reasons, but Brian was upset about this. Then Blaine got upset. Despite having no money and no cameraman now, he still went ahead with filming this movie. He was going to be doing the camera. He was taking lots of money out of his credit cards. He bought all kinds of equipment and even hired crew to help shoot this movie. The actors said at first it was fun, they were all enjoying themselves, but from the very first day, the filming was disastrous. They were supposed to get 5 pages of the script done that first day. They didn't even get 1 done. Aside the crew Blaine hired, none of them had any experience, including Blaine. He was doing the camera, which apparently was a problem. They had problems with the sound. Blaine kept buying more and more props to try and make the trail and the woods look more scary. He got into more and more debt. He was ignoring his young family at home, which started causing more problems for him. In going through the records, she found out that Blaine had gotten into a massive amount of debt. She was very upset because they had a 1-year-old child. Blaine was never around. She actually went to the filming site one day to try and talk to him, but he just didn't seem to care and just kept on filming, kept on buying more and more things for the film set. Meanwhile, Brian at home was becoming more and more resentful because he thought his wife Randy was preventing him to go out and help filming, when in reality all she said was that he couldn't give him the $30,000. The filming continued throughout the week, and people that were acting for him said that he became more narcissistic, they became more uncomfortable working around him. Because this was supposed to be a horror movie, there was a lot of screaming and yelling. This young man by the name of Andrew, trail name Stitch, one day he was camping nearby and he heard a lot of commotion, screaming. He wasn't sure if it was real or if it was just people fooling around. He looked but was unable to find the source of the yelling. This is important for later, so please keep it in mind. Meanwhile, back at the filming site, people actually, because they were staying there overnight and this guy Blaine was just becoming more and more tough and scary to be around, people actually started becoming scared at night. There was all these cicadas around that a lot of them weren't used to. They all were basically tired and frustrated and just wanted this filming to be over with. Finally, after around 8 days of shooting, they were finished filming the movie. They were cleaning up all their props, but they left sort of a mess, and Blaine was on this high because he was so excited about finishing this movie. However, when he got home, he realized that his wife Wendy had left and taken their young son because he had been paying no attention to them and he had racked up all this debt. He was still so confident though in himself that as long as he could get the editing done, this film would be a success. So he turned back to his friend Brian Trimble. The reality is that the movie was awful. Everybody that was in it said that it was awful, but they thought it was funny. Brian, however, thought that this movie was wonderful. He had become so resentful because he felt like his wife wasn't letting him do what he wanted to do, which in reality wasn't true. She was taking good care of him. She was just trying to keep things stable at home. Brian was the one that really had changed. Before he met this guy Blaine, they had wanted to have a family. He was working hard. He was dedicated to the relationship. Then all of a sudden, after meeting Blaine, he just was totally different and became this resentful guy. Then on January 10th of 2003, Randy was coming home from work. People still had their Christmas lights up. She pulled her car into the garage like she always did, then went inside. The next thing that happened, as far as what everyone knew, was that there was a panic 911 call that came in from Brian Trimble. He said that he had just gotten home from having dinner with a friend. He found his wife. She looked like she was bleeding. He didn't think that she was breathing. Police and emergency services were rushed to the scene. What they found was absolutely horrifying. Randy Trimble, 28 years old, was found dead on her garage floor. It looked like she had been strangled, also stabbed. Nothing like this had ever happened in this quiet, safe little neighborhood. The police had no clue. The police taped off the entire street. More and more authorities arrived on the scene. These are some pictures from the actual night of the crime. They brought in a senior detective. They immediately took Brian aside. They asked him where he had been. He said that he had been out to dinner with a friend. This was easily corroborated, so the police thought that Brian was not a suspect. They asked him to go through the events exactly when he got home and what happened. He led the detectives through what happened. He said he got home from dinner with a friend. He found his wife bleeding. He said he didn't think she was breathing. They asked him if he touched her. He said no. The forensics teams got there and were collecting as many clues as they could. Over the next couple days, they got the medical examiner's report. It said that the stab wounds were just excessive, and they believed that this was probably somebody that she knew. The detectives were worried though. They found no DNA, they found no fingerprints or any other evidence, so they really had no leads to go on at that point. Because they were at a standstill, the detective went back to the crime scene. He asked Brian once again to lead him through the events of the night. This time, Brian's story changed. He told the detective that he had gone over, he had touched her, he had tried maybe doing some CPR, which the detective found very strange. Not only that, the forensics report came back on his computer, which came back with some very incriminating evidence. The investigators brought Brian in for a formal interview and told him that they had enough evidence. If he confessed then, they would take the death penalty off the table. The detective told him that they knew he didn't actually commit the crime, but they knew he was involved. So who did it? He quietly said, Blaine Norris did it. The detectives immediately got a search warrant for Blaine's house, his vehicle. They immediately went over there. In his vehicle, they found this receipt, which was a list of all the things that Brian had already told the police that they had planned on using. They had been apparently planning this for months. Brian told the police that they had actually rehearsed it. He had called this friend purposely to have dinner just so that he would have an alibi. The police then knew that Blaine's motive was the money for his film project, but they weren't sure what Brian's motive was. They asked him, and he said he didn't want to put Randy through a painful divorce, which is just ridiculous. Both men openly admitted and pleaded guilty. Brian said that he had hired Blaine Norris to kill his wife. Blaine openly admitted and pleaded guilty to this in court. Both men received life sentences for their crimes. Everybody who knew the men, they knew that things were off, but they didn't know that it was this bad or it could even get this bad. People, friends, family, everyone was shocked. This beautiful, young, loving, caring woman, her life was taken because of a stupid movie and because her husband was selfish and, quote, he didn't want to be married anymore. Just so sad. My thoughts and prayers go out to all of Randy's family, her friends, all of her loved ones. I am so sorry for your loss. If you remember Andrew, Stitch, he was watching TV one day after all this had happened, and a lot of it started making sense because they had mentioned all the movie stuff, the filming. He had watched more newscasts. He knew that he was in this area around the time, and he couldn't help but think, because of the noises he heard, he did realize that, hey, if they were filming a horror movie, obviously it was going to be like that, but he just felt some sort of calling to go back to that area. He heard they may have left a mess. He wanted to clean things up. He wasn't really sure why he was going back. He hadn't finished his hike, so he thought it would be a good time. However, when he did set out, it was very late in September in the season. He knew that the weather was going to be getting cold, but he didn't really think he was going to be out there too long. Personally, I hadn't heard of either of these cases until a retired ranger contacted me via email about 18 months ago and told me she had this story she wanted to share with me. We talked back and forth via email. She sent me this story, both these stories, so I did some more research, looked into it, but all of this part of the story came directly from Annie. Sadly, she passed away from cancer roughly 3 months ago, but in talking with her over the emails, she really did want to share this story. She wanted me to share it with everybody, and I think you'll understand why after I get to the end. Around the same time that Stitch had gone out to the trail, she herself had taken some time off because she wanted to do some personal hiking. She set out on the trail right around the same time and part of the trail that Stitch had. He got that name because he is very good at repairing gear, clothing, things like that. She saw his campfire. The two started talking. She found him very intelligent. She offered him some tea. They ended up camping there together that night, talking into the night. They both had similar plans of hiking up through Pennsylvania, through New Jersey, possibly to New York. The next day, they decided that they were going to hike together. Annie told Andrew she knew of this creek that ran right up around the trail for a little while. It had great water. So they found the creek, hiked up the creek. They were talking throughout the day. This is when Andrew told her the story that I just told you about the film and the tragedy with Randy. She was, of course, shocked. That night, they found a good spot, set up a big campfire. Right around 10 o'clock, she thought she saw something in the night sky. She called Andrew over, but it had already disappeared, so just kind of wrote it off as maybe a shooting star. The next day, the pair got up. Andrew usually hiked in front of her for a little while because he was a faster hiker. Then they would meet up, get some water, maybe have lunch together. They would always meet up later in the evening and camp together. That night, as they were both setting up camp, they saw this flash in the sky, this big white saucer-like shape that seemed to have a tail, and it seemed to have some sort of contrails behind it too. Neither of them could figure out what it was. They stayed up all night talking about it, trying to see it again. Of course, they didn't, but they thought it was very cool but also eerie. They said that the hairs on the back of their neck stood up. The next day, they continued their hike north. They both had cameras, but Annie's was much nicer. It was actually a camera that another ranger had lent to her for her time out hiking. They both noticed how cool the weather had gotten and the leaves were starting to change. It had gotten cloudy. It looked like there was possibly a storm moving in. They found a nice camping spot, talked into the night, both went into their tents and fell asleep. They were shocked when they got up the next morning because it had snowed. It wasn't a lot of snow, maybe 2 inches, maybe 3 at the most, but it was much colder and they were shocked that it had snowed at this time of year. Remember, this is 2003, so they didn't have smartphones. Andrew was the only one that had a cell phone, but he wasn't getting any reception. They walked throughout the day. They passed a lean-to. They finally set up camp, and that night they saw something else in the sky, which looked like, and he said, a spinning Christmas tree. And she couldn't believe it because her parents had told her a story that back in the 70s, people had reported seeing something that looked like a spinning Christmas tree in eastern Pennsylvania. They set up a small campfire, even though both of them didn't want to have a campfire because they didn't want to drown out any possible lights they could see in the sky. The next morning, they got up. It had snowed a little bit more. They were thinking about turning around, but they kept pushing forward. According to what Annie told me, this was the day that things got really weird. Despite them already kind of running into some weird things, she said that the weather was very strange that day. Circular clouds kind of looked like a hurricane, but without any weather. They set up their camp, and the next morning they woke up to a good amount of snow, and it looked like the trees had lost a lot more leaves than they had remembered the day before. Andrew didn't seem to be fazed by this, and she didn't speak up only because she was a ranger. Even though she was new to it, she didn't want to seem inexperienced to this guy that she had met out on the trail and was having such a good time with. At this point, Stitch also said, well, there's no point in trying to find where they filmed that movie and maybe left all that stuff behind because we'll never find it in the snow. So they just kept on going north. At one point, Annie said to Stitch, it's kind of odd that we haven't seen anybody. He also said that he thought that was odd. Then they came across what they thought was an abandoned established campground because there was a bunch of these round fire rings that you often find at campgrounds. So they set up camp around it, had a nice fire, talked about things from their past. Annie had told me, regrettably, they hadn't shared any really basic information about themselves. They were also both concerned because at this point there was roughly 6 inches of snow on the ground. They had no way of knowing what the weather was, and they weren't sure why they weren't running into anybody else. At this point, Annie actually thought they may have been lost, but again, she didn't want to say anything to Andrew, and Andrew was often in the lead, so she thought, based on things that he had said, he was a very experienced hiker, and he probably would have known if they had gone off trail. She jokingly admitted to me she had only been working with the Park Service for a couple of months, and she really had a lot to learn, but she was excited to learn that. That night, unbelievably, they saw that same white saucer-like thing with the contrails fly right over their campsite. Andrew was convinced that this was some kind of UFO. He said that can I have your card or something so I can write you and you can send me the pictures when you get them developed? She said, of course. So she handed him one of her business cards that she had just gotten roughly a week before she had set out for this hike. She said that the next morning, despite all the excitement from the night before, because what she said was that object flew over them several times and then jetted off into the sky like a bullet. Despite this, she had said that they should either turn around or find a trail that leads off so that they can get back to a town because the weather is just too rough. He agreed, and he told Annie he was pretty sure he knew exactly where they were. He was going to go out first. He told her to stay by the fire and keep warm. If he found the trail, he'd come right back either way. After waiting over an hour and the sun fully up, she followed his trail. She noticed that he had came back and made a right, so she followed those footprints off, and they led to this clearing. They stayed along the tree line, and then all of a sudden, where these reeds were, they just disappeared. And these footprints were deep. There was no way he could have turned around. There was no markings like that. She had no idea what to think. She went back to the campsite that they had been staying at. She made a campfire and she just waited. Despite them not knowing each other very well, she didn't think that Andrew wouldn't have come back for her that day, especially since they had been planning to try and get out of the woods. She got up early that morning, walked the same direction, looked all over, tried finding him. She eventually came across a lean-to that they had passed one of the previous days. She knew she was going in the right direction. At this point, she didn't know what to think. She made a big campfire that night. She was hoping that Andrew was somewhere in the area and would see it. He never showed up. She then started thinking. She realized she didn't even know his last name. She only knew his first name and his trail name. She eventually made her way out of the trail. She immediately told her friend that was also a ranger. The ranger said, well, if he is missing, someone's going to report him missing. She said, definitely don't mention the UFO stuff to our superiors, and definitely don't try and go looking for him by yourself. Annie didn't listen to this part. She went back after a couple of days and she had more gear. She looked all over, but she was never able to find Andrew. She was just hoping that since he had her business card and he was so excited about the UFO or whatever it was, he would contact her, but he never did. She had no way of contacting him, but of course she always monitored the missing reports. No name like that ever came up. She said that anytime she sees footprints in the snow now, it always reminds her of the time that she was hiking with Andrew. She said she never did find out what happened to him. She hoped and prayed that he made it off okay, but she also wondered why he wouldn't have contacted her. Maybe he lost the business card. Who knows? She also thought, well, maybe it had something to do with the UFO, but there still was a lot of stigma at that time about things like that. People were ridiculed. People still are, but it's much less now, especially in our neoteric society. Annie had seen one of my videos that I made in the very beginning of my channel when I said meeting an angel on the Pacific Crest Trail, when I had gone through the earthquake and I met another hiker that really helped me. And I said that if you're ever watching this, thank you and God bless. She wanted me to make this video for the same reasons. She knew that if I told this story the same way that it happened, including the terrible tragedy that Andrew had told her about at the beginning of their hike, plus the UFO part, if he ever saw this, he would know that it was Annie from the time that they hiked together on the Appalachian Trail. So Andrew, Stitch, if you are out there and you ever see this, please let me know. Sadly, Annie passed around 3 months ago, but I'm sure she would love to know that you were okay and that she remembered you. I know people are going to ask my whole theory on the UFOs and that kind of thing. I didn't really have an opinion until I saw these pictures that the Hubble took. It's been over 10 years now. NASA saw this black spot in space, so they pointed the telescope to take a few pictures. When they came back, it was just unbelievable. Over 10,000 galaxies just in that one spot. Each galaxy having over 4 billion stars, 1 to 3 billion planets. Now that we have the James Webb telescope out there, which is 100 times more powerful than the Hubble and is the only satellite that's not in a low Earth orbit. I'm gonna have a picture to show you that if it's hard to kind of explain and show without, they have a great picture of it and diagram on NASA's website if you wanna see it better, but it's basically at this point called Lagrange 2. You can see the sun there and then the Earth there, and then right on the right there is where the James Webb orbits. One of the reasons I think that a lot of this is true is because that over the years, so many high-ranking generals or governors that were in power at a time and they would deny it, then after they were out of power or retired, all of a sudden they're all coming forward over the last 5 years especially. Not just in the United States, all over the world this is happening. A lot of the pictures back from the 1940s and 50s where they have the negatives, it's been impossible for people to prove that they're not something we can identify. Then there's all these triangle pictures that I'm sure a lot of people have seen. So I don't know, I think a lot of it's probably fancy military aircraft that we don't know about yet. But then some of them, maybe a small percent, are really something that we really don't know about. When you think about just the amount of planets in our own galaxy, around 300 billion, and scientists believe now that maybe 100 million of those are Earth-like planets. And if you think about the Kardashev scale, that's the scale that kind of rates societies. We're not even a level 1, we're a 0. Basically, a level 1 is when a planet is able to utilize all the resources of their planet. They've come together in global unification, which we're not even close to. The scientists and people that follow this theory, they say that we're roughly 500 years for getting to this level. A level 2 is a stellar society. They've been able to harness all the power of their sun, possibly using something like a Dyson sphere, which has actually been theorized that it's possible to do. Again, we're years, maybe thousands of years from being able to do that. A level 3 is a galactic society. They've been able to harness all the power in their galaxy. They're able to do interstellar travel. But if we were ever to reach a level 2, just the power of the sun, we'd have enough power to create and stabilize wormholes, which would create interstellar travel much quicker, probably the only way we'll ever really be able to do it. Here's another picture of what a theorized Dyson sphere looks like. It's an interesting topic to discuss, but there's so many things to consider. There's human variation, there's belief systems, there's the way people look at things. Looking at objects in space can be very confusing because the size via our eyes can be very misleading. I'll give you an example. The face on Mars, the picture that's been floating around since the 70s that one of the Voyager satellites that we put out took a picture of. I'll have it right here. If you look at that picture, depending on who the person is looking at that, you'll say, how big is it? Well, people will answer in all different variations. It's actually almost 2 miles long and almost 2 miles wide. Unfortunately, with all of our modern technology, as wonderful as it is, it also makes making fake things like fake UFOs much more feasible. It's almost impossible to determine the fake from the real. In the past, they would ask people for the negatives. Now, that's really not as common as it once was. I would definitely like to hear your thoughts on this whole video. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for all your support, your comments, your feedback. You guys are awesome. Special thank you to co.ag for providing the background music. Hopefully I will see you all in the next one. Take care. Hey everyone, thanks for sticking with me to the end. I think all of you will find this kind of funny. The original person, a pilot, for working search and rescue. His name is Keith Arnold. He was flying over Mount Rainier in 1947 on a search and rescue mission when 6 flying saucers, as he coined the phrase, flew past his plane. And this is where the term flying saucer came from. I just thought that was kind of cool that it was a search and rescue mission that ultimately led to that phrase being coined. I would love to hear from you all if you've ever seen a UFO, or if you were in a town like Phoenix and saw the Phoenix lights, anything like that. Please leave a comment, share your stories. All right, see you next time.